The truth shall set you free, a well-known biblical expression from the Old Testament and repeated hundreds of times over the entrance of universities, libraries, and even the CIA. It perhaps may best apply to an extraordinary artist, addicted to truth. Born in 1842 in Cherepovets, Russia, of well-to-do aristocratic parents, Vasily Vereshchagin's work was hailed that of a genius who challenged governmental and military leaders in several countries throughout his long career. It will challenge you watching the story of his life and his work unfold. Encouraged to pursue a military career by his father, Vereshchagin was sent to military school, graduated first in his class, but was drawn to the life of an artist. After studies with the great Jean-Léon Gérôme in Paris, he became attached as an artist to a Russian military force to crush a Muslim uprising in Samarkand, present-day Uzbekistan, not yet 20 years old. Vereshchagin gained his first experience in violent hand-to-hand combat and was praised by Russian regular troops for his bravery and was awarded a medal for his conduct. He was, however, engaged in cleaning up the gruesome aftermath of battle and bodies of several hundred mutilated and beheaded Russian troops. At a young age, Vereshchagin was now experienced in the war and the mathematics of attrition. This experience likely solidified his resolve to document the side of war the public never saw and would never really know happen. 2 years later, he produced a 4 by 6 foot masterpiece of frightening impact entitled Apotheosis of War, meaning the peak, the pinnacle, the highest point of war. Wherever this monumental work was exhibited, it incited strong public reactions by sympathizing with the devastating effects of war and human barbarism. Perhaps more frightening, this was not the work of a deeply disturbed imagination. It was real, and had been the practice of conquering armies for hundreds of years all across Central Asia, where skull mounds were not an uncommon sight. The same year, Vereshchagin painted, quote, "They are triumphant," showing Khanite or Muslim troops in Samarkand in Registran Square, celebrating killing many Russian troops and raising their heads on the top of long poles. This, too, was a fairly common practice during wars in the late 19th century, especially in this part of the world. This work displays the monumental talent of an artist not yet 30. In similar vein, this work, entitled Display of Trophies, contrasts the masterful carvings on the columns with a pile of severed heads of the Khan's enemies. Again, a common practice throughout history when either tongues, heads, ears, scalps, or private parts were presented to properly account for the number of dead, especially if a bounty were being paid to mercenary troops. During Vereshchagin's career, it seems Russia was always in armed conflict with someone, giving the artist continuous material to work with. The Turks, Great Britain for control of India and Afghanistan, uprisings in Turkestan, naval engagements with Japan, etc. Not all of Vereshchagin's work was dedicated to the horrors of war. His architectural skill is evident in Gur Emir Mausoleum, Uzbekistan. But clearly, his impact as an artist featured the human figure. It's been said his Orientalism was seen through the eyes of the poor and the beggar. His travels exposed him to extraordinary figures to capture in their local environment. This is a series of remarkable images executed in Tashkent. Entitled Dervishes in Tashkent, is one of the finest works of pure color, pattern, and brilliant patchwork in the figures' garments. It is truly worthy of careful study. Equally compelling, but telling a much different story, this piece is entitled Political Debate in an Opium Den. It makes a stark contrast to the previous work, but commands a close look at the breathtaking detail in their worn and ragged clothes. Adding a touch of music, Vereshchagin has entitled this piece A Dervish Chorus, Begging Alms, Tashkent. Reflecting the traditional dress that we've seen in the earlier examples, this is a group of 9 figures drawing attention to themselves and their needs. Street acts, well, not quite like this, exist to this day. The artist would occasionally dip back into historical images, like this remarkable piece entitled The Doors of Tamerlane. Interestingly, when Vereshchagin completed the controversial Apotheosis of War skull pile, it was intended to be ascribed to Tamerlane in its title, but Vereshchagin changed it to be more timeless and more universal. The original idea had merit. Tamerlane, the 14th century ruler known as the Lord of Destruction, whose ruthless wars over decades killed an estimated 17 million people, 5% of the world's population. To emphasize the timeless intent of Apotheosis, he inscribed a dedication, quote, to all great conquerors, past, present, and future. He entered this and a second work entitled The Forgotten, depicting a dead and decaying Russian soldier surrounded by crows picking at his body at an opening in St. Petersburg in 1874, and these 2 pieces were denied, stating they, quote, represented Russian military poorly. This would not be the only time exhibiting the horrors of war would create controversy. For most of his career, Vereshchagin walked a fine line between being considered a nationalist or a subversive, a patriot or a revolutionary. Shortly afterwards, he departed for India, Tibet, and the Himalayas for almost 2 years. This is the only image I've found of Tibet, entitled Western Tibet, 1875. However, Vereshchagin's work from India is exceptional, starting with a display of his skill as a pure landscapist in this piece depicting an entry into India entitled Passage Through Kashmir, 1875. As you see, his magnificent Indian paintings, it's a fact Vereshchagin was strongly against British rule in India. Likewise, the British were suspicious of him as well. Of truly monumental proportions and the 3rd largest painting in the world, 16 by 23 feet, is, quote, the state procession of the Prince of Wales in Jaipur, end quote, seen as the triumph of British rule over India, led by the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII. Of course, the symbolic image of India is the Taj Mahal in Agra. Vereshchagin has chosen an unconventional but convincing view of this magnificent structure, built in 1620 by Shah Jahan as a tomb for his favorite wife. This is another perspective and unconventional interpretation of the Taj and surrounding grounds. Here is a massive Indian elephant in elaborate trappings, and a howdah, or mounted litter for figures to sit in. The Indian elephant is fully capable of being domesticated for transportation and labor, compared with the African elephant, which cannot. Vereshchagin was never very far away from the people, wherever he was. This is an image of a fakir, or holy man. Initially, it applied only to Muslims, the origin of the term, but became more loosely applied to Hindus as well. They were ascetics who renounced worldly possessions and lived on alms. Vereshchagin did numerous portraits of the common people. This is an especially penetrating view by the artist. He did execute a few portraits of high-ranking and elite members of the community. He is well remembered for saying he had never and will never paint the portrait of a general. He captured images of both Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Jews. Here is a complex image of 3 Buddhist gods painted in Sikkim in 1875, entitled the Kalmyk Lama. These are people of Mongolic ethnic group residing in southwestern Russia, and the only inhabitants of Europe whose national religion is Buddhism. The Kalmyk people developed a relationship with Russia to be left alone, as long as they defended Russia's southern borders. But with the anti-religious 1917 Russian Revolution, much of their culture was destroyed, followed by Stalin's paranoia in 1943, had the entire population shipped to Siberia. Only after Stalin's death were the remaining Kalmyk people allowed to return to their lands. This is an image of the interior of a Kalmyk place of worship, again emphasizing the extent of Vereshchagin's travels. This is a Buddhist temple in Darjeeling, in the far northeast part of India, where the Darjeeling tea comes from. This image features the Buddhist prayer wheels, but a careful look in the lower right corner reveals a single figure at prayer. This last religious image is brilliantly colored but puzzling, entitled Buddhist Lama. The figure appears to be wearing a large black mask of a falcon of some sort. In 1883, Vereshchagin traveled to Palestine and the Holy Lands, where he of course painted one of the world's great symbols of faith, Solomon's Wall or the Wailing Wall. Although the composition's perspective is similar to numerous other versions, Vereshchagin has enclosed more figures in varying positions of seated, kneeling, standing, both in prayer and quiet conversations. This second image most likely places the conversing Jews against the Wailing Wall behind them. The predominantly white and black palette creates a stark contrast. It seems even Vereshchagin's representation of Christ in his painting entitled A Crucifixion in the Time of the Romans drew criticism from various Christian sources for the depiction of Christ being, quote, vulgar and overly Semitic, end of quote. In addition to capturing images of the major religions throughout the region, Vereshchagin was equally intrigued by the people themselves and painted scores of nationalities. Still drawn to scenes depicting the aftermath of conflict, this work is entitled Ruins of a Chinese Pagoda, executed in 1870. This is an image of the nomadic Kyrgyz people on the move, painted in 1869. He did not seek to avoid beauty. Here we see a traditional Japanese lady attending to flowers. This is the profile portrait of a young Uzbek boy, painted in 1868. This is a rapidly painted image of a Kazakh man in 1867. Its rough, granular finish suggested it may have been painted on the spot with charcoal or pastel. There are two images of Afghan warriors. The first helps explain why the Afghans have caused many would-be conquerors so much heartache, especially the Russians. The second Afghan appears equally determined to remain independent of foreign interference. This stunning image of a Bukhara warrior executed in 1873. Bukhara is an ancient city dating back to the 9th century in Uzbekistan. Here we see a rather portly Kyrgyz in colorful dress who is a hunter with his falcon, painted in 1871. Kyrgyzstan is a small, landlocked country in Central Asia and traditionally nomadic. The last and intentionally mysterious figure is entitled the Albanian warrior, who appears to almost be too overloaded with weaponry to be effective in a conflict situation, but it would not be advisable to test this out. Vereshchagin was one of the very few Western artists to ever venture into these remote areas of the steppe, the ancient Silk Road, and the stands: Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. In 1876, Vereshchagin returned from his travels and settled in Munich, seen here in his studio. He focused on his anti-war paintings until he's drawn into the Russo-Turkish War, 1877 and 78. In this conflict, his brother is killed, and he's severely wounded while serving on the mine-laying vessel Shutka. Symbolic of all Russian military conflicts is this well-known image entitled Mortally Wounded, representing a Russian soldier clutching the wounds in his chest, running from the conflict behind him. Even before fully recovering from his wounds, Vereshchagin departs for Bulgaria and the siege of Plevna against the Ottomans. Here, Vereshchagin depicts a quiet moment of Russian troops dug in at a strategically vital location called Shipka Pass. In this conflict, the Ottoman forces were defeated, and true to his beliefs, Vereshchagin does not depict heroic battle scenes. Instead, the brutal consequences. This is a panoramic view of wounded and dying Russian soldiers overwhelming an aid station represented by the tents behind them. Vereshchagin painted each figure individually so there would be no identical poses or gestures. His courage in this conflict earned him the gold sword of bravery, but he refused to accept it. At the end of the Russo-Turkish War, he painted Requiem Vanquished in 1879, depicting a Russian priest giving last rites to a field of dead Muslims. When exhibited in Russia, the generals were outraged at sympathy for the Turks. Vereshchagin simply responded, quote, "You see the truth." He is later quoted as saying, "Observing life, wholesale murder is called war, while killing individuals is called execution." Throughout these years, Vereshchagin was exhibiting his work throughout the world's major venues. He was constantly in the press on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1882, at an exhibit in Germany, he was accompanied by Field Marshal Moltke, and upon seeing Apotheosis, Moltke forbade the German army from seeing the exhibit. The same thing happened in Austria. He exhibits in America in 1880, not that long after the end of the Civil War. General William Sherman, commander in the Civil War, accompanies him and, profoundly moved, declares Vereshchagin the greatest painter of the horrors of war that ever lived. These exhibitions were drawing between 50 to 200,000 visitors. The U.S. exhibit sold 45,000 catalogs. Universally, his work drew praise from those who participated in war and condemnations from those responsible for starting and carrying out the conflict. Over the years, Vereshchagin was drawn to witness the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 95, between the Qing dynasty and the Empire of Japan, over influence and control of Korea. The Spanish-American War in 1898, where he painted the classic image of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders charging up San Juan Hill. The Boxer Rebellion in 1900, which was an uprising in China by ultranationalists that were anti-foreigner, colonialism, and Christian, that butchered 32,000 Chinese Christians, whose government supported the objective was to throw out all foreigners. Much of the conflict occurred in Peking, where assaults on foreign legations. The U.S. Marines stationed in the Philippines were sent in force along with other nation forces to crush the rebellion, as portrayed in the 1963 film 55 Days in Peking with Charlton Heston. The American conflict in the Philippines in late 1901 lasted roughly 3 years. Here is an image of American troops interrogating a prisoner. This is another work of an American trooper on horseback and wounded. Although likely executed during the Philippine campaign, Vereshchagin has painted a painfully universal scene of a military hospital with a wounded soldier and a nurse beside him, entitled Letter Home to Mom. The soldier is most certainly an American combatant, and the artist's message applies to the consequences of all wars. Later in his life, Vereshchagin confessed that his struggle to portray the senseless horrors of war would sometimes bring him to tears while painting these images. But in an interview, he explained his strong belief in truth and authenticity, and the only way to achieve this as an artist was to experience firsthand the subject being painted. Anything less was at best a half-truth. Vereshchagin chose the most romanticized and false subject to pursue, the horrors of war. His convictions caused difficulties and rejections, as well as praise. The Russian government did not purchase any of his works for 30 years. He was forced to destroy a number of his war pictures because of the unrelenting pressure in his home country, Russia. A major turning point in European-Asian relations occurred in 1904 and 05 with the Russo-Japanese War, fought over imperialist designs on Manchuria. When the first time in modern history an Asian power defeated a European nation, Japan defeated Russia. Strangely, the conflict was brought to a conclusion when Teddy Roosevelt brokered the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was signed in Kittery, Maine. Russia's humiliation and its defeat contributed to the Russian Revolution of 1905 and solidified the Japanese military leaders' power, which they exercised right up into World War II. Unable to resist documenting yet another war, Vereshchagin was aboard the Russian battleship Petropavlovsk when it struck a Japanese mine and sank, with a loss of 700 lives, including Vasily Vereshchagin, ending the most remarkable life and career. In a way, was quite possibly preordained. The man who had fought against myth and falsehood to depict the truth had fallen at the hand of his dark muse. While researching Vereshchagin's uncompromising depictions of man's base instinct to slaughter one another, I question whether there was ever any humor in his work. Very little. He was vocally critical of Napoleon's penchant for conflict, and one of his 24 published books was an attempt to debunk Napoleonic myth, which, not surprisingly, was banned in France. His view was reflected in this painting entitled, quote, "Bad News from France." Well, depending upon one's viewpoint, this is humorous. Now, if all you've seen hasn't totally convinced you of Vasily Vereshchagin's unflinching, unwavering dedication to painting the truth, this image of Russian troops in the field is not only real, but humorous also.
Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra, a new soap rich as a cream. Cleopatra, a secret of beauty.
Egyptomania, quite an impressive word. It means interest in ancient Egypt as it applies to pop culture that appeals to ordinary people, and the desire of modern folks to incorporate ancient Egypt into contemporary culture. From architectural, as seen in this somewhat garishly decorated pavilion entrance to a zoo in Antwerp, Belgium, built in 1856, to a Palmolive soap print ad of the 1920s, promising the beauty secrets of Cleopatra. However, fascinations with ancient Egypt goes back some 3,000 years. The Romans occupied Egypt from 30 BC for over 600 years, during which time it was popular to decorate homes in Rome with actual as well as copied Egyptian artifacts. The first, Julius Caesar, fell under the spell of ancient Egypt, as did Mark Antony, but perhaps for different reasons. And so much was looted and displayed back in Rome that it was said tourists could experience the thrill of Egypt without ever leaving the city. Even earlier, around 450 BC, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus believed Greek culture was directly influenced by ancient Egypt. With the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 and the rise of Islam, there was little direct European contact with Egypt, but the quantity of items looted and shipped to Europe kept the interest alive until Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Egypt in 1798. Along with 37,000 troops, were 167 of France's finest scholars, scientists, artists, architects, whose sole purpose was to capture, record, and preserve all they saw. This monumental effort resulted in a true gift to European grasp of, quote, the Orient, as it was called at that time, and a 22-volume masterpiece of knowledge, including 1,000 engravings. By the time this largest publication ever was produced, Napoleon had died. This publication triggered a massive rekindling of Egyptomania throughout Europe and later America. As an addendum to French forces in Egypt, a major discovery occurred in 1799 while they were digging a foundation to a French fort in the Nile Delta region near the town of Rashid. The Rosetta Stone, carved in 196 BC. At the time of its discovery, nobody could translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, not even the present-day Egyptians. It remained a mystery. A French philologist finally cracked the mystery and decrypted the images, discovering the code to translating the hieroglyphics in 1822, almost a quarter century after its discovery, thus adding more impetus to Egyptomania. By the second quarter of the 19th century, a few intrepid explorers and artists ventured into Egypt. As infrastructure and travel conditions improved in Egypt, it led the wealthier Europeans to indulge in the, quote, grand tour, as seen here. It also led to a mass exodus of ancient Egyptian relics. The wealthier the tourists, the more items were being packed and shipped back to Europe. It also led to the widespread practice of defacing ancient structures by carving initials and other messages into these ruins, as seen here by these, quote, lonely Victorian ladies. The next spike in Egyptomania began during the 1850s with the extensive discussions about building the Suez Canal across the Isthmus of Suez in Egypt, connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. This stretches 120 miles between Port Said and Suez. In a touch of historical irony, the initial conclusion by French engineers in 1850 was that it couldn't be done because there was a 30-foot difference in elevation between the two seas. It was several years before discovery of this error. The sea level is the same worldwide. The Suez Canal was completed in 1869. This triggered a certain, quote, cultural arms race to acquire all kinds of ancient Egyptian objects among the European nations, especially France and England. The Victorian era in England encompassed a 63-year period from 1837 to 1901. It was a time of great political and social change. The Industrial Revolution, authors like Charles Dickens and Charles Darwin, a railway and shipping boom, profound scientific discovery, etc. While many lasting and marvelous creations, especially in architecture, were inspired by Egyptomania, one especially ghoulish practice emerged called mummy mania. Archaeological digs were unearthing mummies in quantity. In fact, it's known Napoleon, as a gift to his dear wife, brought a mummified head with him when he fled Egypt in 1799. This fetish spawned a unique European mania for mummies, which were being acquired and shipped back to Europe. These discoveries were being reported globally in the news. They became a fascination, and social parties were held where the, quote, event of the evening was unwrapping a mummy, seen here in this image circa 1890. Victoria, England, developed the belief that ground up and tinctured mummy remains could cure everything from the bubonic plague to a headache. Here's a picture of a container of mummy remains, quote, suitable for medicinal purposes. Constant stories and news reports about mummies fueled an obsession, and even tour companies advertised that not all mummies were found in tombs. There were open pits of mummified dead, and the traveler could discover his, quote, very own mummy. The mummy became the ultimate souvenir. The mummy obsession found its way to the U.S. in literature, with writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Some Words with a Mummy, and Louisa May Alcott, Lost in a Pyramid, or The Mummy's Curse. In addition to serious literature, this was the era of the illustrated weekly publications like The Graphic, Leslie's Weekly, and Harper's. They carried mummy stories as well. They were also a vehicle for America's brilliant political cartoonist Thomas Nast. His target of ridicule was Samuel Tilden, leader of the Democratic Party. Tilden was well known for numerous fraudulent schemes, and nevertheless was still his party's candidate for the presidency in 1876 against Rutherford B. Hayes. Nast chose Egyptian imagery, picturing Tilden and his running mate, Governor Hendricks of Indiana, as mummies wrapped up in an anthropoid coffins. Between the two coffins is Anubis, the Egyptian god of embalming. Nast continued using the mummy device when Tilden was caught trying to buy the election of 1880. Boy, isn't it good this sort of behavior doesn't happen now. Certain symbols emerged that the West found appealing. One in particular was the scarab. It's found in the earliest of Egyptian ruins and represents resurrection, closely associated with the sun god Khepri, which brings the sun up from the night, thus associated with rebirth and protection in the afterlife. It's often found in film and mystery novels. Perhaps knowledge is dangerous. The scarab may lose its mysterious allure when one realizes it is modeled after the dung beetle.
Now they too have seen it, a dog food with a look and taste like no other.
King cuts.
Tender cuts made with luscious lean meat, dogs just go nuts for.
King cuts.
The king of all dog foods.
King cuts.
The event that all but solidified the continuous impact of Egyptomania was in 1922 when English archaeologist Howard Carter discovered the tomb of the boy king, Tutankhamun, in the Valley of the Kings. Carter had been excavating this region for 30 years. Tombs of many pharaohs of greater stature had been unearthed earlier, but the difference was most had been robbed and plundered for centuries earlier. Tut's was not. It was the richest discovery up to that point. Roughly 5,000 objects were found in the tomb, and it took Carter and his team 10 years to catalog them all. This image is Carter at the tomb site. This is a panel from one of the interior walls. Considering Tut's short reign of only 9 years meant the buried tomb was over 3,000 years old. The color and details are remarkable. The discovery contributed much to serious study of ancient Egypt, but also unleashed an avalanche of consumer fascination, helped with decades of publicity and traveling museum exhibitions popularizing the items from the tomb site. The single most recognizable piece is Tutankhamun's death mask, which became, this is not a pun, the face of the exhibitions. This is the boy king's sarcophagus and various representations of him while on his throne. What would the world's greatest discovery of the world's most intriguing society be without a curse? The curse is actually associated with the disturbance of all mummies and tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, and disturbing their embalmed remains. It is said to bring about bad luck, illness, and death. But it quickly became King Tut's curse. Is it real? Consider Carter's partner and financier, Lord Carnarvon, was found dead a short time after the opening of the tomb. At exactly the time of his death, his dog back in England let out a howl and died. Carnarvon's half-brother died of blood poisoning. Two close friends of high social standing died of mysterious causes after visiting Cairo. Carter gave an object from the tomb to a dear friend in England, whose mansion burned down shortly after receiving it, and after it was rebuilt, it was flooded. It's known that moments after opening Tut's tomb, there was an unexplained electric power outage in Cairo, and apparently Carter's canary was eaten by a cobra at the site's opening. Well, on a grander scale, some folks actually blame the sinking of the Titanic and the start of World War I on the mummy's curse. On the positive side, significant steps were taken by the Egyptian government to preserve its ancient heritage and to put a stop to rampant looting. Seen here are restoration steps being undertaken in Tut's tomb. Tutankhamun's rule produced little that was noteworthy. He was frequently in ill health, thought to have suffered malaria, and extensive inbreeding within his family likely contributed to his early death. Carter's discovery of Tut's tomb and the extent of funereal objects, revealing much about the pharaohs, made Tut the best-known figure of ancient Egypt. Commercial endeavors quickly grabbed onto the phenomena, and soon an endless string of Tut objects were on the marketplace. Here are a few. Tut cup. Well, coffee cups are common. Zippo lighter. A good 20 years late. Tut watch with a special feature. It goes back 3,000 years. Headband for a man with a Harley hog. His and hers t-shirts. Very woke. Flip-flops. What can I say? Tut face mask. Missed the trend. Tut iPhone cover. Very trendy. Anke tablet leggings. Well, no Tut face, but it's just too good to pass up. Lastly, an alien Tut. Perfectly appropriate since aliens are thought by some to have built the pyramids.
Behold thy tomb, O mighty pharaoh.
Too flat.
What is it you want?
I want
That!
insert key to reveal the secret of Pharaoh Amenhotep.
Oh!
Egyptomania, from its beginning through the 19th century, is likely most visible and longest lasting in the field of architecture. The adaptation of ancient Egyptian designs occurred widely across the Western world. Here are a few examples. This is a magnificent building in Penzance, England, built in 1835, currently the home of the National Trust. Beautifully designed, and you can see that the dog even likes it too. This extensive relief work is on the entry of the Alexander Palace, now a park and former home of Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar. This was built around 1830 and located south of St. Petersburg, Russia. This sepia-toned image is the Egyptian pavilion at the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris. Well, here, ignore the heavy-handed advertising for bingo and focus on the architectural features of the Mecca Social Club in London, built in 1930. The influence of Egyptian design applied to interior as well. This is the interior of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch of Scotland, constructed in 1900 in Edinburgh. This extraordinary image is known as the Blue Hall in the Palace of Dostenkino, located just outside Moscow and decorated in 1797, which is earlier than the impact of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Definitely America participated in architectural Egyptomania. Right near us is this entry to a cemetery in New Haven, constructed in 1845 with Egyptian-esque columns and the winged scarab above the entryway. This is the front of the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose, California, built in 1932. The largest collection of Egyptian artifacts in the U.S., totaling over 42,000 items, is in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. This is an interior scene. Here is a masterpiece, the First Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee, built in 1849. To give Egyptomania architecture a different look, this is a storage facility in a Chicago winter. It does have a different feel in snow. Throughout the entire post-Napoleon invasion era, other Egyptian images appeared in public spaces. Among the more popular was the Sphinx. An example seen here is in London, circa 1880. Well, in retrospect, not all were placed in ideal locations. This particular Sphinx is located adjacent to a fountain in Paris around 1858 and would appear to have something of an upset stomach. Of course, never missing an opportunity. Here is the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, complete with all three, the Sphinx, obelisk, and the pyramid. And if one needs more evidence of the impact of the Tut discovery, there are 27 major movie houses throughout North America, constructed with an Egyptomania theme, all built after Tut's discovery in 1922. The first of these was the iconic Grauman's Egyptian Theater in Hollywood. Equally adept at, quote, not missing an opportunity was the leading showman of the day, P.T. Barnum, and the Barnum and Bailey Circus, with a 1,250-person spectacular depicting Cleopatra watching the approach of Mark Antony and the conquering Roman army. The oldest fraternal organization in the world, tracing its origin to the end of the 14th century, is the Freemasons. In simple terms, it was founded for the help of its members and others in need, with the use of Egyptian symbolism to accompany their elaborate secret ceremonies. Even before Napoleon's invasion, the Freemasons were using Egyptian iconography. Mozart, an avid Freemason, revealed Egyptian ties in his composition, The Magic Flute. This influence often followed specific events. After Lord Nelson's defeat of the French Navy in Egypt, the English manufacturer of porcelain and earthenware, Wedgwood, produced many items like this tea set, complete with an alligator handle, and efforts at hieroglyphics that definitely no pharaoh ever saw. Ceramics of distinctive shapes were also produced, such as this piece by Wedgwood, circa 1815. The French national manufacturer of porcelain, Sèvres, contributed to distinctive shapes, circa 1811. Following the publication of Napoleon's massive description of Egypt, the French produced monumental clocks reflecting Egyptian imagery. Not surprisingly, Egyptomania became popular in furniture making. This elaborate table, supported by 3 Nubian figures, was produced in 1805 and was in the home of Napoleon and Josephine. Here is an extraordinary commode, elaborately decorated with Egyptian symbolism, built in 1828. The woodwork is exquisite. I would say the end goal of Egyptianized furniture is when it is actually made in Egypt. This totally Egyptomized desk was produced at the Madrasa Craft School located north of Cairo in 1926. The world of jewelry was energized with Egyptian revival pieces, as complex as this heavily decorated neck collar piece, which harkens back to Cleopatra, or less elaborate with the scarab as the centerpiece, and even a jeweled Mont Blanc pen, although I'd be reluctant to bring it to work. The world of Egyptomania would occasionally wander off into unexpected places. Who would have thought the Singer's sewing machine company could find a way to use it, even just for pure decorations? But they did in 1912. Even food companies took a shot at it, but slightly less successful. Here are King Tut lemons from Santa Barbara, California. My favorite of all, quote, organic kamut flakes with raisins, brought to you by Trader Joe. How about that? Well, actually, there's a whole range of kamut grain foods.
3,000 years in here, and nothing but priceless treasures. It would have cost those guys a lot less to give me McDonald's bacon double cheeseburgers, my favorite food, and only $1.69. But hey, what a garage sale I'm gonna have.
Egyptomania has made a big effect on women's fashions as far back as 1802. After each major event, like Napoleon's invasion, construction of the Suez Canal, discovery of Tut's tomb, and films like Cleopatra, there would be a burst of fashion adaptations, perhaps best symbolized by Style on the Nile. Prompted by the allure of mummy mania, this creation leans towards the extreme and would definitely invite quite a conversation. This work appeals to the darker arts for sure. As an accessory, this beaded evening bag, with a scene of Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti, would be an elegant choice. The Egyptomania evening out would not be complete without, quote, a Ramesses perfume, the secret of the Sphinx, end quote, in a Baccarat-style flacon, 1917. Never to be ignored, our collective passion to be entertained. The entertainment industry latched onto Egyptomania in a big way. The earliest films from the beginning of the 20th century focused on Cleopatra and the ill-fated love affair with Mark Antony, when 6 pictures were made in 18 years. The best remembered of the early Cleopatra films was in 1932 with Claudette Colbert, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. The next major effort to capture the story was in 1945 with Vivian Leigh, about the struggle to rule Egypt, and Claude Rains played Julius Caesar. Catastrophe on set, which seems to come with Cleomania. Filmed in 1945 in London, when occasionally German bombs disturbed the set and one almost killed the director. The weather was bitter cold. The screenplay was written by George Bernard Shaw, who repeatedly criticized Lee's performance. She became pregnant with she and Laurence Olivier's much-wanted child, but suffered a fall and lost the baby. Things went downhill afterwards, but she finished the shoot, but refused to attend the opening night premiere and did not see the completed film until years later. One review summed it up. Quote, Vivien Leigh's Cleopatra seems drained of life besides Caesar. There was more Cleopatra in her Scarlett O'Hara than in this pale elf, end quote. It was the most expensive British film ever made up to that point. It failed at box office and basically scuttled the director's career. On the happy side, Claude Rains was the first actor to be paid $1 million for his role. The next blockbuster effort was dramatically impacted Egyptomania, was Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, released in 1963. Everything short of not finishing the film happened. Directors fired. 3 of the leading 4 actors were released. Burton was brought in as a replacement. Time and massive budget overruns made it, once again, the most expensive film up to that point. $31 million, which is about $280 million in today's money. The entire production being moved from London to Rome, Taylor almost dying of pneumonia. To cut costs, editing cut 180 minutes, 3 hours, leaving the film a mere 251 minutes, 4 hours, for the final version. But the scandalous on-set affair with 2 already married, Taylor and Burton, was so thoroughly covered in the worldwide press that even the Pope chimed in with his disapproval. So, what's next with Cleomania? Maybe it's time to bring in Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot. Correct. Lengthy talks at the studio level are underway. It could be an all-woman's effort. Actor, director, screenwriter, executive director, production studio. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. History is usually messy and more complex, especially when it spans several thousand years and doesn't follow the preferred narrative of a movie script. Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. He installed Ptolemy, a favorite general, to become its ruler. Thus began the Ptolemaic reign, which lasted almost 300 years. If sometimes ancient Egyptian pharaoh images appear to have classic Greek sculptural features, it is because they were Greek. Ptolemy and all of Egypt's pharaohs and bureaucratic elite during the Ptolemaic era were Macedonian Greeks. They spoke Greek. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was Greek, spoke Greek, and was the last ruler of Egypt from the Ptolemaic range, committing suicide in 30 BC in the face of Roman conquest of Egypt. What does fit the narrative, she was very adept at using sex as an effective tool with the then Roman leaders in an effort to retain control of Egypt. She had 4 children, 1 with Julius Caesar and 3 with Mark Antony. We'll see how future films on Cleopatra treat real history.
Cleopatra was the most powerful woman in Egypt. Watching Prime Video, she realized rulers could give back. So she ordered some gifts with Prime. After that, it was more of a one team, one dream kind of vibe. Couldn't give up all the gold though. Prime changed everything.
We've looked at the strange fascination with mummies, so it's no surprise that with the development of film, the mummy would become the center of attraction in the burgeoning horror genre. Fresh off his success, the 1931 Frankenstein film, Boris Karloff made Mummy in 1932 with a 3-week shooting schedule and very uncomfortable makeup procedure. The film was a modest success, but it spawned 14 more mummy movies in the US and the UK over the next 80 years. What might best be described now as a tired franchise. Even A-listers like Tom Cruise and Russell Crowe could not pump more life into it. I'm not sure that life into a mummy is the best analogy. It was a box office flop, but has lots of cruise action sequences. Perhaps a female mummy, and somehow Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the plot caused viewer confusion. Is it possibly time to stop rewrapping the mummy and let it rest in peace or pieces, as the case may be? Of course, many important films stem from Egyptomania, like 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, and a cast of thousands that more or less follow historical understanding of ancient Egypt. The pure myth and imagery of the region was captured in silent film by the short-lived Rudolph Valentino in films like The Sheik in 1921 and The Son of the Sheik. His rise to international stardom and The Latin Lover was meteoric, and his tragic death from peritonitis at 31 years old was sudden. It is said women were known to have killed themselves out of anguish and despair. Something of a musical was tried in 1965 with the eminently forgettable Harem Scarum and a familiar face. Efforts at capturing Egyptomania in live stage performance, as seen here in this 1985 production at the Lido Theatre in Paris, might be praiseworthy, but seen up close lacks a certain, well, good taste. As the world has become more democratized, it has also fostered the growth of free enterprise and consumerism. The sometimes annoying engine behind this is advertising, especially in consumer goods. Egyptian imagery has been used in advertising for skincare and beauty products, but especially in the tobacco industry. Colgate-Palmolive launched a campaign for Palmolive soap in 1910 based upon its use of palm and olive oils, delivering the beauty of Cleopatra. Frequently, the finest illustrators of the day were employed. Here we see a 1925 print ad for the brand painted by Dean Cornwell, among the most productive and sought-after artists during the, quote, golden age of illustration. This is the artist in Egypt researching material for the ad. Beguiling copy lines were used like, quote, once a queen's secret and the reincarnation of beauty, up until the 1950s. At the turn of the century, there were 1,000 cigar factories registered with the federal government and over 1 billion cigars smoked a year, all packaged in magnificently decorated boxes displayed in tobacco shops. This is a lithographer's color proof of The Pride of Egypt cigar box cover, followed by Lord of Egypt with accompanying imagery. This Egyptomania cigar box design was printed without a manufacturer's name, so it could be used by small producers so they could print their own name on it. Perhaps Osan cigar label used the most Egyptian symbolism, including Egyptian beauties and a winged scarab at the bottom of the crescent. The cigarette industry was equally as competitive and anxious to capitalize on Egyptomania, with names like Egypt Deities and Mogul. The most enduring name was Camel, introduced in 1913. Well, today, enduring may not be a good thing. And the tobacco wars led R.J. Reynolds to introduce Joe Camel campaign, aimed directly at a younger audience. It received immediate criticism and lasted from 1988 until 1997, when it was pulled after a piece of research showed that 6-year-olds could match Joe Camel with cigarettes almost equal to Mickey Mouse with Disney.
Hollywood's brightest stars are Camel smokers. Tony Curtis smokes Camels, so does Jane Greer, so does John Wayne, and one of the newest favorites, Paramount's Charlton Heston. Mr. Heston, what especially do you like about Camels?
Well, I don't know anything about the scientific tests various cigarettes claim or any of the things they say they have. I just know I like the taste of Camels. I find them very mild for me, too.
Yes, America's smokers have shown an overwhelming preference for Camels.
By now, we've seen how extensively Egyptomania appealed to the Western cultures. It is a field of constant study and publications documenting the centuries-old phenomena. To conclude our look at Orientalism, we return to one of the most interesting artists of the period, Hungarian-born Gulya Tornay. In addition to skill, thorough training, and living in Morocco for a decade, Tornay was known for his uncommon humor, irony, and wit in his paintings. This example is entitled The Unfair Game. Shows a group of figures playing a board game and a sudden difference of opinion. The facing seated figure is protesting something, while the standing figure looks away, arms outstretched, brushing aside whatever the complaint may be. This is a partial image of a group of figures, likely Berbers, in Tornay's studio in Tangier, painted in 1892. They appear puzzled, despite paying close attention to some unseen object. As if Orientalism has traveled full circle, they are studying themselves, quite possibly never having seen such a painting and at a loss, wondering, how was it done? This concludes our series, inspired by the Orientalists, Western artists in Arabia, the Sahara, Persia, and India, written by Christian Davies. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as we have in bringing it to you.